Climate change denial, or global warming denial, is part of the global warming controversy. It involves denial, dismissal, unwarranted doubt, or contrarian views contradicting the scientific opinion on climate change, including the extent to which it is caused by humans, its impacts on nature and human society, or the potential of adaptation to global warming by human actions. Some deniers do endorse the term, but others often prefer the term climate change skepticism. However, several scientists researching this phenomenon have noted that skepticism is a misnomer and an inaccurate description when referring to those who deny anthropogenic global warming. In effect, the two terms form a continuous, overlapping range of views, and generally have the same characteristics. Both reject, to a greater or lesser extent, mainstream scientific opinion on climate change. Climate change denial can also be implicit, when individuals or social groups accept the science but fail to come to terms with it or to translate their acceptance into action. Several social science studies have analyzed these positions as forms of denialism and pseudoscience. The campaign to undermine public trust in climate science has been described as a denial machine organized by industrial, political, and ideological interests, and supported by conservative media and skeptical bloggers to manufacture uncertainty about global warming. In the public debate, phrases such as climate skepticism have frequently been used with the same meaning as climate denialism. The labels are contested. Those actively challenging climate science commonly describe themselves as skeptics, but many do not comply with common standards of scientific skepticism and, regardless of evidence, persistently deny the validity of human-caused global warming. Although scientific opinion on climate change is that human activity is extremely likely to be the primary driver of climate change, the politics of global warming have been affected by climate change denial, hindering efforts to prevent climate change and adapt to the warming climate. Those promoting denial commonly use rhetorical tactics to give the appearance of a scientific controversy where there is none. Of the world's countries, the climate change denial industry is most powerful in the United States. From 2015 to 2017, after having already served from 2003 to 2007, the United States Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works was chaired by oil lobbyist and climate change denier Jim Inhofe, who had previously called climate change the greatest hoax ever perpetrated against the American people and claimed to have debunked the alleged hoax in February 2015 when he brought a snowball with him in the Senate chamber and tossed it across the floor. He was succeeded in 2017 by John Barrasso, who similarly said, "The climate is constantly changing. The role human activity plays is not known." Organized campaigning to undermine public trust in climate science is associated with conservative economic policies and backed by industrial interests opposed to the regulation of CO2 emissions. Climate change denial has been associated with the fossil fuels lobby, the Koch brothers, industry advocates, and conservative think tanks, often in the United States. More than 90% of papers skeptical on climate change originate from right-wing think tanks. The total annual income of these climate change counter-movement organizations is roughly $900 million. Between 2002 and 2010, nearly $120 million, £77 million, was anonymously donated via the Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund to more than 100 organizations seeking to undermine the public perception of the science on climate change. In 2013, the Center for Media and Democracy reported that the State Policy Network, SPN, an umbrella group of 64 U.S. think tanks, had been lobbying on behalf of major corporations and conservative donors to oppose climate change regulation. Since the late 1970s, oil companies have published research broadly in line with the standard views on global warming. Despite this, oil companies organized a climate change denial campaign to disseminate public disinformation for several decades, a strategy that has been compared to the organized denial of the hazards of tobacco smoking by tobacco companies. Terminology: climate change skepticism and climate change denial refer to denial, dismissal, or unwarranted doubt of the scientific consensus on the rate and extent of global warming, its significance, or its connection to human behavior, in whole or in part. Though there is a distinction between skepticism, which indicates doubting the truth of an assertion, and outright denial of the truth of an assertion, in the public debate phrases such as climate skepticism have frequently been used with the same meaning as climate denialism or contrarianism. The terminology emerged in the 1990s. Even though all scientists adhere to scientific skepticism as an inherent part of the process, by mid-November 1995 the word skeptic was being used specifically for the minority who publicized views contrary to the scientific consensus. This small group of scientists presented their views in public statements and the media, rather than to the scientific community. This usage continued. In his December 1995 article "The Heat is On, the Warming of the World's Climate Sparks a Blaze of Denial," Ross Gelbspan said industry had engaged a small band of skeptics to confuse public opinion in a persistent and well-funded campaign of denial. His 1997 book "The Heat is On" may have been the first to concentrate specifically on the topic. In it, Gelbspan discussed a pervasive denial of global warming in a persistent campaign of denial and suppression involving undisclosed funding of these greenhouse skeptics with the climate skeptics, confusing the public and influencing decision-makers. A November 2006 CBC television documentary on the campaign was titled "The Denial Machine." In 2007, journalist Sharon Begley reported on the denial machine, a phrase subsequently used by academics. In addition to explicit denial, social groups have shown implicit denial by accepting the scientific consensus, but failing to come to terms with its implications or take action to reduce the problem. This was exemplified in Kari Norgard's study of a village in Norway affected by climate change, where residents diverted their attention to other issues. The terminology is debated. Most of those actively rejecting the scientific consensus use the term skeptic and climate change skepticism, and only a few have expressed preference for being described as deniers, but the word skepticism is incorrectly used, as scientific skepticism is an intrinsic part of scientific methodology. The term contrarian is more specific, but used less frequently. In academic literature and journalism, the terms climate change denial and climate change deniers have well-established usage as descriptive terms without any pejorative intent. Both the National Center for Science Education and historian Spencer R. Weird recognize that either option is problematic, but have decided to use climate change denial rather than skepticism. Terms related to denialism have been criticized for introducing a moralistic tone, and potentially implying a link with Holocaust denial. There have been claims that this link is intentional, which academics have strongly disputed. The usage of denial long predates the Holocaust, and is commonly applied in other areas such as HIV/AIDS denialism. The claim is described by John Timmer of Ars Tech NICA as itself being a form of denial. In December 2014, an open letter from the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry called on the media to stop using the term skepticism when referring to climate change denial. They contrasted scientific skepticism, which is foundational to the scientific method, with denial, the a priori rejection of ideas without objective consideration, and the behavior of those involved in political attempts to undermine climate science. They said not all individuals who call themselves climate change skeptics are deniers. But virtually all deniers have falsely branded themselves as skeptics. By perpetrating this misnomer, journalists have granted undeserved credibility to those who reject science and scientific inquiry. In June 2015, Media Matters for America were told by the New York Times public editor that the newspaper was increasingly tending to use denier when someone is challenging established science, but assessing this on an individual basis with no fixed policy, and would not use the term when someone was kind of wishy-washy on the subject or in the middle. The executive director of the Society of Environmental Journalists said that while there was reasonable skepticism about specific issues, she felt that denier was the most accurate term when someone claims there is no such thing as global warming, or agrees that it exists but denies that it has any cause we could understand or any impact that could be measured. History. Research on the effect of CO2 on the climate began in 1824, when Fourier discovered the atmospheric greenhouse effect. In 1860, Tyndall quantified the effects. Arrhenius in 1896 showed that coal burning could cause global warming. In 1938, Callendar found it already happening to some extent. Research advanced rapidly after 1940. From 1957, Roger Revelle alerted the public to risks that fossil fuel burning was a grandiose scientific experiment on climate. NASA and NOAA took on research. The 1979 Charney Report concluded that substantial warming was already on the way, and a wait-and-see policy may mean waiting until it is too late. In response to increasing public awareness of the greenhouse effect in the 1970s, conservative reaction built up, denying environmental concerns which could lead to government regulation. With the 1981 presidency of Ronald Reagan, global warming became a political issue, with immediate plans to cut spending on environmental research, particularly climate-related, and stop funding for CO2 monitoring. Reagan appointed as Secretary of Energy James B. Edwards, who said that there was no real global warming problem. Congressman Al Gore had studied under Revelle and was aware of the developing science. He joined others in arranging congressional hearings from 1981 onwards, with testimony by scientists including Revelle, Stephen Schneider, and Wallace Smith Broker. The hearings gained enough public attention to reduce the cuts in atmospheric research. A polarized party political debate developed. In 1982, Sherwood B. Idso published his book Carbon Dioxide, Friend or Foe, which said increases in CO2 would not warm the planet, but would fertilize crops and were something to be encouraged and not suppressed, while complaining that his theories had been rejected by the scientific establishment. An Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, report in 1983 said global warming was not a theoretical problem but a threat whose effects will be felt within a few years, with potentially catastrophic consequences. The Reagan administration reacted by calling the report alarmist, and the dispute got wide news coverage. Public attention turned to other issues. Then the 1985 finding of a polar ozone hole brought a swift international response. To the public, this was related to climate change and the possibility of effective action, but news interest faded. Public attention was renewed amidst summer droughts and heat waves when James Hansen testified to a congressional hearing on June 23, 1988, stating with high confidence that long-term warming was underway with severe warming likely within the next 50 years, and warning of likely storms and floods. There was increasing media attention. The scientific community had reached a broad consensus that the climate was warming, human activity was very likely the primary cause, and there would be significant consequences if the warming trend was not curbed. These facts encouraged discussion about new laws concerning environmental regulation, which was opposed by the fossil fuel industry. From 1989 onwards, industry-funded organizations including the Global Climate Coalition and the George C. Marshall Institute sought to spread doubt among the public, in a strategy already developed by the tobacco industry. A small group of scientists opposed to the consensus on global warming became politically involved, and with support from conservative political interests, began publishing in books and the press rather than in scientific journals. This small group of scientists included some of the same people that were part of the strategy already tried by the tobacco industry. Spencer Weir identifies this period as the point where legitimate skepticism about basic aspects of climate science was no longer justified, and those spreading mistrust about these issues became deniers. As their arguments were increasingly refuted by the scientific community and new data, deniers turned to political arguments, making personal attacks on the reputation of scientists, and promoting ideas of a global warming conspiracy. With the 1989 fall of communism and the environmental movement's international reach at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, the attention of U.S. conservative think tanks, which had been organized in the 1970s as an intellectual counter-movement to socialism, turned from the Red Scare to the Green Scare, which they saw as a threat to their aims of private property, free trade market economies and global capitalism. As a counter-movement, they used environmental skepticism to promote denial of the reality of problems such as loss of biodiversity and climate change. In 1992, an EPA report linked secondhand smoke with lung cancer. The tobacco industry engaged the APCO Worldwide Public Relations Company, which set out a strategy of astroturfing campaigns to cast doubt on the science by linking smoking anxieties with other issues, including global warming, in order to turn public opinion against calls for government intervention. The campaign depicted public concerns as unfounded fears supposedly based only on junk science in contrast to their sound science, and operated through front groups, primarily the Advancement of Sound Science Center, TASC, and its junk science website, run by Stephen Milloy. A tobacco company memo commented, "Doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy." During the 1990s, the tobacco campaign died away, and TASC began taking funding from oil companies including Exxon. Its website became central in distributing almost every kind of climate change denial that has found its way into the popular press. In the 1990s, the Marshall Institute began campaigning against increased regulations on environmental issues such as acid rain, ozone depletion, secondhand smoke, and the dangers of DDT. In each case, their argument was that the science was too uncertain to justify any government intervention, a strategy it borrowed from earlier efforts to downplay the health effects of tobacco in the 1980s. This campaign would continue for the next 2 decades. These efforts succeeded in influencing public perception of climate science. Between 1988 and the 1990s, public discourse shifted from the science and data of climate change to discussion of politics and surrounding controversy. The campaign to spread doubt continued into the 1990s, including an advertising campaign funded by coal industry advocates intended to reposition global warming as theory rather than fact, and a 1998 proposal written by the American Petroleum Institute intending to recruit scientists to convince politicians, the media, and the public that climate science was too uncertain to warrant environmental regulation. The proposal included a $5 million multi-point strategy to maximize the impact of scientific views consistent with ours on Congress, the media, and other key audiences, with the goal of raising questions about and undercutting the prevailing scientific wisdom. In 1998, Gelbspan noted that his fellow journalists accepted that global warming was occurring, but said they were in Stage 2 denial of the climate crisis, unable to accept the feasibility of answers to the problem. A subsequent book by Milburn and Conrad on the politics of denial described economic and psychological forces producing denial of the consensus on global warming issues. These efforts by climate change denial groups were recognized as an organized campaign beginning in the 2000s. Riley Dunlap and Aaron McCreight played a significant role in this shift when they published an article in 2000 exploring the connection between conservative think tanks and climate change denial. Gelbspan's Boiling Point, published in 2004, detailed the fossil fuel industry's campaign to deny climate change and undermine public confidence in climate science. In Newsweek's August 2007 cover story The Truth About Denial, Sharon Begley reported that the denial machine is running at full throttle, and said that this well-coordinated, well-funded campaign by contrarian scientists, free market think tanks, and industry had created a paralyzing fog of doubt around climate change. Referencing work of sociologists Robert Antonio and Robert Brull, Wayne A. White has written that climate change denial has become the top priority in a broader agenda against environmental regulation being pursued by neoliberals. Today, climate change skepticism is most prominently seen in the United States, where the media disproportionately features views of the climate change denial community. In addition to the media, the contrarian movement has also been sustained by the growth of the Internet, having gained some of its support from Internet bloggers, talk radio hosts and newspaper columnists. The New York Times and others reported in 2015 that oil companies knew that burning oil and gas could cause climate change and global warming since the 1970s but nonetheless funded deniers for years. Dana Nusatelli wrote in The Guardian that a small fringe group of climate deniers were no longer taken seriously at the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference, in an agreement that we need to stop delaying and start getting serious about preventing a climate crisis. However, the New York Times says any implementation is voluntary and will depend on any future world leaders, and every Republican candidate in 2016 has questioned or denied the science of climate change. Denial networks. United States. A poll conducted by the New York Times Magazine in 2006 found that only 56% of Americans believe that average global temperatures have risen even though scientists think that they have. Majority of Americans also believe that scientists are still divided on the issue. A study in 2008 from the University of Central Florida analyzed the sources of environmentally skeptical literature published in the United States. The analysis showed that 92% of the literature was partly or wholly affiliated with a self-proclaimed conservative think tank. A Pentagon report has pointed out how climate change denial threatens national security. A study from 2015 identified 4,556 individuals with overlapping network ties to 164 organizations which are responsible for the most efforts to downplay the threat of climate change in the U.S. A study was conducted to determine whether or not conservative white Americans were more likely to deny climate change. Researchers from Lyman-Briggs College took samples of conservative white males of different understandings of global warming and categorized them separately. Categorized into three groups: conservative white males who claim to understand global warming, conservative white males who claim not to understand global warming, and other individuals. It was concluded that many of these conservative white males who self-report understanding global warming believe that the mass media has over-exaggerated the effects of global warming and climate change and that the effects of it have never happened. 48.4% of conservative white males who report understanding global warming very well in the study said that the effects of global warming will never happen, compared to 19% who do not understand it very well and 7.4% of all other adults. Many people appear to be confused by climate science. However, the study showed that the people who self-reported understanding global warming were most prone to denying. Another study by Utah State University discusses geographic variation on climate change opinions at state and local scales in the United States. It was noted that prior research was found that public climate change policy support and behavior are significantly influenced by public beliefs, attitudes, and risk perceptions. In addition, to complement previous stated factors, they're also influenced by knowledge, emotion, ideology, demographics, and personal experience. Where people live can account for some significance. Since some people live in weather extreme areas, they could be desensitized to the overall change in climates as well. Surveys were conducted and showed that 63% of Americans believe that global warming is happening, 47% believe that it is human-caused and 42% believe that most scientists think it is happening. In the study, a model was constructed to determine the public opinion of climate change across the nation. Representative telephone-based surveys were used to investigate opinions in 4 states: California, Texas, Ohio, and Colorado, in addition to the Columbus and San Francisco metropolitan areas. International. The Clexit Coalition claims to be a new international organization, which aims to prevent ratification of the costly and dangerous Paris Global Warming Treaty. It has members in 26 countries. According to The Guardian newspaper, Clexit leaders are heavily involved in tobacco and fossil fuel-funded organizations. Arguments and positions on global warming. Some climate change denial groups allege that CO2 is only a trace gas in the atmosphere, and has little effect on the climate. The scientific consensus, as summarized by the IPCC's Fourth Assessment Report, the U.S. Geological Survey, and other reports, is that human activity is the leading cause of climate change. The burning of fossil fuels accounts for around 30 billion tons of CO2 each year, which is 130 times the amount produced by volcanoes. Some groups allege that water vapor is a more significant greenhouse gas, and is left out of many climate models. However, water vapor has been incorporated into these models since the inception of climatology in the 1800s, and while it is also a greenhouse gas, CO2 remains the primary driver of increasing temperatures. Climate denial groups may also argue that global warming stopped recently, a global warming hiatus, or that global temperatures are actually decreasing, leading to global cooling. These arguments are based on short-term fluctuations, and ignore the long-term pattern of warming. These groups often point to natural variability, such as sunspots and cosmic rays, to explain the warming trend. According to these groups, there is natural variability that will abate over time, and human influences have little to do with it. These factors are already taken into account when developing climate models, and the scientific consensus is that they cannot explain the observed warming trend. Global warming conspiracy theories have been posited which allege that the scientific consensus is illusory, or that climatologists are acting on their own financial interests by causing undue alarm about a changing climate. Despite leaked emails during ClimateGate, as well as multinational, independent research on the topic, no evidence of such a conspiracy has been presented, and strong consensus exists among scientists from a multitude of political, social, organizational, and national backgrounds about the extent and cause of climate change. Several researchers have concluded that around 97% of climate scientists agree with this consensus. As well, much of the data used in climate science is publicly available to be viewed and interpreted by competing researchers as well as the public. In 2012, research by Stefan Lewandowski, then of the University of Western Australia, concluded that belief in other conspiracy theories, such as that the FBI was responsible for the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr., was associated with being more likely to endorse climate change denial. Climate change denial literature often features the suggestion that we should wait for better technologies before addressing climate change, when they will be more affordable and effective. Taxonomy of climate change denial. In 2004, Stefan Ramstorff described how the media give the misleading impression that climate change was still disputed within the scientific community, attributing this impression to PR efforts of climate change skeptics. He identified different positions argued by climate skeptics, which he used as a taxonomy of climate change skepticism. Later the model was also applied on denial. Trend skeptics/deniers, who deny there is global warming, argue that no significant climate warming is taking place at all, claiming that the warming trend measured by weather stations is an artifact due to urbanization around those stations, urban heat island effect. Attribution skeptics/deniers, who accept the global warming trend but see natural causes for this, doubt that human activities are responsible for the observed trends. A few of them even deny that the rise in the atmospheric CO2 content is anthropogenic. Additional CO2 does not lead to discernible warming, that there must be other natural causes for warming. Impact skeptics/deniers, who think global warming is harmless or even beneficial. This taxonomy has been used in social science for analysis of publications, and to categorize climate change skepticism and climate change denial. Sometimes, a fourth category called consensus denial is added, which describes people who question the scientific consensus on anthropogenic global warming. The National Center for Science Education describes climate change denial as disputing differing points in the scientific consensus, a sequential range of arguments from denying the occurrence of climate change, accepting that but denying any significant human contribution, accepting these but denying scientific findings on how this would affect nature and human society, to accepting all these but denying that humans can mitigate or reduce the problems. James L. Powell provides a more extended list, as does climatologist Michael E. Mann, in 6 stages of denial, a ladder in which deniers have over time conceded acceptance of points, while retreating to a position which still rejects the mainstream consensus. CO2 is not actually increasing. Even if it is, the increase has no impact on the climate since there is no convincing evidence of warming. Even if there is warming, it is due to natural causes. Even if the warming cannot be explained by natural causes, the human impact is small, and the impact of continued greenhouse gas emissions will be minor. Even if the current and future projected human effects on Earth's climate are not negligible, the changes are generally going to be good for us. Whether or not the changes are going to be good for us, humans are very adept at adapting to changes. Besides, it's too late to do anything about it, or a technological fix is bound to come along when we really need it. Journalists and newspaper columnists including George Monbiot and Ellen Goodman, among others, have described climate change denial as a form of denialism. Denialism in this context has been defined by Chris and Mark Hoofnagel as the use of rhetorical devices to give the appearance of legitimate debate where there is none, an approach that has the ultimate goal of rejecting a proposition on which a scientific consensus exists. This process characteristically uses one or more of the following tactics. Allegations that scientific consensus involves conspiring to fake data or suppress the truth, a global warming conspiracy theory. Fake experts, or individuals with views at odds with established knowledge, at the same time marginalizing or denigrating published topic experts. Like the manufactured doubt over smoking and health, a few contrarian scientists oppose the climate consensus, some of them the same individuals. Selectivity, such as cherry-picking atypical or even obsolete papers, in the same way that the MMR vaccine controversy was based on one paper. Examples include discredited ideas of the medieval warm period. Unworkable demands of research, claiming that any uncertainty invalidates the field or exaggerating uncertainty while rejecting probabilities and mathematical models. Logical fallacies. In 2015, environmentalist Bill McKibben accused President Obama, widely regarded as strongly in favor of action on climate change, of catastrophic climate change denial, for his approval of oil drilling permits in offshore Alaska. According to McKibben, the president has also opened huge swaths of the Powder River Basin to new coal mining. McKibben calls this climate denial of the status quo sort, where the president denies the meaning of the science, which is that we must.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.